Yeah, thank you. Today I want to talk about something very, very interesting, the great educational promise and the great disappointment. And you will soon realize why I'm making this discussion. You know, we have studied for success, but success was studying something else. And there is perhaps no greater story of frustration in modern Africa than the story of the child who actually obeyed every instruction, followed every rule, excelled in every examination, graduated with distinction, and then discovered the life was not making the same script. And that is a challenge that I want us to have a discussion. So, ideally, from say nursery school, we were told, read hard, you know, we were told, be number one in class, we were told, education is the key to success. We sang that song everywhere, you know. And they told us without education, you will suffer. They told us the poor are poor because they actually never took school seriously. So the message is often, many times, repeated by parents, by teachers, by religious leaders, by politicians, by the society itself. So a child grows up believing that life is an examination and that success belongs to the person with the highest marks. And so we study. We find ourselves burning the midnight oil, including myself. And we sacrifice and we burn the midnight oil, like they say, and sometimes our parents go through a lot. Or we parents sometimes go through a lot. We sell land, we skip meals because we want our children to go to school. Our different fathers work overtime, and the family invests everything in one dream. So education first, success automatic later. But then comes graduation that day, yeah, when we are peeling all those gowns, and that is where many discover that the most painful lessons of all time, and you discover that the world outside the classroom is not governed by classroom rules, and that is the biggest frustration you may discover in life. So the day really arrives, yes, but reality also does arrive. So reality arrives quietly, so you graduate and you frame your degree somewhere, yes, so and so graduated magna cum laude or summa cum laude, and then you upload your graduation photographs and everyone congratulates you. They are merrymaking and gormandizing, they are jubilating and they are eating, they are tearing chicken left, right, and center. And then weeks become months, yeah, and then months become years, and then you discover, wait a minute, I have to look for this job, and then the job, lo and behold, does not come, and then you realize, wait a minute, the opportunities are few, you know, and the competition becomes brutal in a sense that everything is really hard. The salary, if it comes, it barely even survives inflation. And then something even more disturbing happens. You look around, you just look around, and you discover, wait a minute, the richest man in my village actually never completed secondary school. And then you begin to ponder. The owner of the largest hardware shop barely speaks English. Actually, they call me often to help them translate or read certain contracts. And then you discover the woman importing goods from Dubai has never written a university dissertation, doesn't even know how to pronounce the word dissertation. And then the man who actually dropped out of senior four now owns fleets of trucks. And then you discover, wait a minute, the former so-called academic failure employs university graduates. Suddenly, a dangerous question enters your mind. What exactly was I preparing for all these years? My friends, it's when you realize that in life there are actually two universities. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of our generation is that there are actually two universities. University number one is called the school system. This university teaches us certain concepts. They teach us, say, mathematics. They teach us history. They teach us literature. They teach us law. And we can begin to recite all these laws from A to Z. They teach us medicine. They teach us engineering. And therefore, we have a grasp of some of these concepts that were propounded by certain individuals way back in Europe. They teach us economics. And the challenge we have here, that this kind of education does reward. Yes. What does it reward us? It rewards us with obedience. It rewards us with memorization. It also rewards us with examination performance and academic discipline. Yes? And so we are bred. We come off as these individuals who are qualified. And these are important, perhaps very important. Why? Because no doubt society needs doctors. It needs lawyers, it needs engineers, it needs professors, it even needs scientists. But my friend, there is another university. University number two, the University of Survival. That is where many of us go wrong. This university does teach certain concepts. It teaches what they call risk-taking. It teaches what they call negotiation. It teaches what they call selling, perhaps a product. It teaches what they call networking as a concept of survival in society. It teaches what they call opportunity spotting, putting yourself in those positions where you can actually market yourself. It teaches what they call financial management. It teaches what they call entrepreneurship as a concept. It teaches what they call human psychology. It also teaches things like market understanding. Those are things many times they don't teach you in university. So its examinations are actually conducted daily. Its grades are measured in income, in terms of influence, but also in terms of resiliency. And unfortunately, many people, graduates from the first class university, without even ever attending the second, find themselves in deep calamity. The vital assumption becomes that the education system often makes one dangerous assumption that academic excellence automatically converts into economic success. Ask me. But history repeatedly proves otherwise. My friends, academic excellence and economic success are related, but they are not identical. A brilliant student can become poor. An average student can become wealthy. A wealthy entrepreneur can actually struggle academically. A professor can earn less than a trader. A PhD holder can work for a business owner who never finished school. This, my friends, is not because education is useless. Far from that. It's because education is only one variable among the many. That is where often we miss the point. What school often fails to teach is that, for example, many graduates know For example, Newton's law. They could cite Isaac Newton's law. They could talk about constitutional doctrines. They could talk about chemical equations. They could argue in terms of medical terminology. Yes? But many have never been taught how to start a business. Go and ask some of those graduates in masters, in business administration or associations or whatever. They can't even identify market gaps. They can't even negotiate a contract. They don't even know how to invest money or even how to manage a debt, for example. And so we find ourselves with these multiple disciplines, but unable to generate or build multiple income streams. We don't even know how to survive unemployment, for example, or how to market ourselves. This irony, my friends, is very painful. A graduate, for example, may know how international financial systems operate, but not how to create a personal gadget in terms of a personal budget. You'll be amazed to notice that even a first-class student may understand economic theories, but not understand how to generate economic value. Yes? That, my friend, is an African educational contradiction. Because Africa presents this contradiction more vividly, perhaps in many places and in many communities. The teacher, for example, teaches business owners' children. Yes? The lecturer teaches future entrepreneurs. The graduate writes applications for traders. The trade pays the graduate. He who engages in trade pays the graduate. The graduate may even speak in fluent English. The trader speaks fluent opportunity. One has mastered information. The other has mastered application. And markets usually reward application. That is something we have to understand. Therefore, what then informs the missing equation? Perhaps society should stop teaching certain things. Study hard and you will succeed. As a lecturer myself, I have said that 1,001 times to my students. But you see, this statement is incomplete. The more honest statement would be, for example, study hard, develop skills, build networks, understand money, learn how people work, identify opportunities, take calculated risks, and continuing learning after school. Alvin Slaughter said the illiterate of the 21st century is not the one who can read or write, but one who cannot read, learn, unlearn, and relearn. The sentence becomes attractive and is much closer to reality. One who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So, why do many parents feel betrayed? The pain is not only felt by graduates. No. We parents do feel that pain as well. I feel that pain. But more importantly, I'll tell you my personal stories of how I've been able to channel this. So imagine selling family land, for example, to educate a child. Imagine sacrificing 20 years of your life. Imagine paying tuition from nursery school to university. Then seeing your graduate child return home unemployed. And you continue fending for them like they've never gone to school, like they've never had an opportunity. So this disappointment is not merely financial, it becomes emotional. It feels as though society should promise that reality failed to honor. It sold a promise that reality failed to honor. So therefore, the real purpose of education, perhaps the greatest correction we need, is philosophical in a sense. In a sense that education, perhaps, was never supposed to guarantee wealth. Education was supposed to increase capability. School children should not be viewed as a ticket to riches. It should be viewed as a tool. And like every tool, its effectiveness depends on how it is used. A degree, whether master's or PhD, is a weapon. It's not necessarily a victory. It is a weapon, not necessarily a victory. A qualification is a key. It's not the destination. A qualification is a key, but not necessarily a destination. Knowledge is potential energy, and it only becomes useful when converted into action. That is what fulfills the paradox of education. So the new African education revolution, if you ask me, the future should require a different model. How? A child should learn, no doubt about that. They should learn in school, yes. They should be bred and nourished in literacy, no doubt about that. They should be bred and nourished in numeracy, no doubt about that. They should be bred and read in science, no doubt about that. They should be even more importantly bred and nourished in critical thinking. They should also be bred and nourished in ethics. They should be bred and nourished in civic responsibility. Now, alongside school, because many of the things, unfortunately, are not in our traditional schools, we should be acquainticizing ourselves with things like entrepreneurship, with things like financial literacy, with things like communication. All these things have a point, and I'll give you practical examples of how this has impacted my life, but also other people's life. Digital skills, problem solving, practical trades, AI, innovation. The idea of dogma should be thrown out. Wealth creation as a discipline. All these will inform you as an individual and will impact you. The future, my friends, belongs neither to pure academics nor to pure entrepreneurs. It belongs to those who can combine both worlds. And as I said, I will give you practical examples in light of what I'm explaining. So the ultimate lesson, my friends, therefore becomes the tragedy is not that education failed. No, far from that. The tragedy is that many of us were taught that education alone was enough, including myself, unfortunately. But, my friends, it's not enough. The farmer who understands markets, for example, the trader who understands opportunity, the engineer who understands business, the lawyer who understands innovation, the doctor who understands investment, the professor who understands entrepreneurship. These are the people most likely to thrive in today's modern world. The challenge, therefore, is not to abandon education. Far from that. The challenge is to redefine it. For the future purpose of education is not merely to pass examinations. Far from it. Instead, is to prepare a human being for life. And life, unlike school, does not award marks for memorization. No, it doesn't. Life awards marks for value creation, for adaptability, for courage, for relationships, for judgment, for resiliency, and the ability to solve real human problems. That may be the lesson Africa is only now beginning to learn, unfortunately. My friends, this is a very disturbing subject because many of us are only realizing it too late. And therefore, the problem we have has unconsciously merged in 3 or 4 different concepts or aspects. Because education as a fundamental number 1, then the question of success as a fundamental number 2, then the question of wealth as concept number 3 becomes very, very important for us. Yet, these are not the same thing. Why? Education can increase the probability of success. Success can increase the probability of wealth. But education is not wealth itself. And I will give examples. And wealth is not necessarily the evidence of education. That is where the confusion begins. As a parent, as a lecturer of law, as a scholar, sometimes I experience what I would call the educator's paradox. I know education is valuable. I have seen education transform lives. I have seen it produce doctors who save lives, engineers who build bridges, lawyers who defend, liberty, and scientists who eradicate diseases. Human civilization itself was built upon accumulated knowledge. Yet, I also observe another reality, and that is the education paradox. The market often rewards value creation more than credentials. And value creation can come from both educated and uneducated. The sugarcane farmer may not understand constitutional law, for example, but he or she does understand supply chains. He does understand demand. He does understand timing. Yes? And even understands negotiation and negotiation skills. He understands risks, for example. And the markets pay him for solving a problem. Meanwhile, the graduate may possess vast knowledge. He may not yet even have found a way to convert that knowledge into value that others are willing to pay for. This is the painful reality. Because academia has traditionally associated intellectual superiority with practical superiority. Life repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. The school of life is very different from the school at university. So the deeper irony is that neither side envies itself. Why? The graduate envies a businessman. The businessman envies a graduate. I'm talking about the businessman who has not gone to school, but extremely successful. You know them. They're your neighbors. And such a businessman may say, I wish I had studied. We have seen them. We have heard them. But they have the other thing that the graduate doesn't have. And the graduate says, wait a minute. I wish I had started a business earlier. They are all admiring one another in one or the other. I have seen that happen in life. Each, for example, sees what he or she lacks. Neither do they fully appreciate what each possesses. The trader, for example, fears being cheated because he cannot read contracts. The professor, on the other hand, fears poverty because he cannot read markets. Yes? So each is insecure in a different way. And that is very serious when it comes to the lesson of life, the hard lessons of life. So, therefore, the real question, my friends, is never whether education is actually a mistake. No. No. Because clearly it has never been a mistake. The real question, my friend, therefore becomes, why did we expect education to do what it was never designed to do? That is the question. School was originally designed to produce informed citizens, skilled professionals, and even knowledgeable individuals. It was not originally designed to guarantee wealth. Remember that. So somehow, society gradually transformed it into a promise of economic salvation. You know, the expectation became too heavy. Education was asked to carry a burden it could not carry alone in that regard. And that becomes the education paradox. As I said, many of us have gone through this education paradox. And yet, despite all these frustrations, you ask yourself, should I tell my children not to study? Are you saying that? My answer would still be no. Absolutely no. There is nothing perhaps that can substitute education, because the evidence of history remains overwhelming that education does expand different options in our lives. It increases adaptability, for example. Yes. It reduces vulnerability, for example. Yes. It creates opportunities and improves decision making, for example, because you are now operating at that platter of an informed person. It opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. So the problem is not that education should be viewed as a foundation, not fundamentally so, but more predominantly as a foundation to create opportunities rather than looking at it as a final destination. So a child should study, yes, hard, but the child should also learn how, for example, money works. A child should also learn how markets do work. A child should also comprehend how people think, yes, and how opportunities do emerge, yes, and how negotiations do take place, yes. All these become important in the school of life. So we should learn, my friend, to take even calculated risks in certain things that may come our lives. So in other words, children or individuals should learn both the classroom, but also the street life that informs our day-to-day operations, because that fundamentally is going to take the biggest chunk of our lives. So what many people are experiencing may even be deeper in the context of them failing to understand what went wrong. So they are confronting realization that many intellectuals reach in sometimes of their midlife. So because we are taught that intelligence is the supreme currency of life, and then it introduces us to other currencies, we forget that life eventually introduces us to other currencies. Currencies like courage, currencies like timing, currencies like social capital, currencies like emotional intelligence. All these are fundamentally important. Currencies like persistence, they're important. Currencies like risk tolerance, fundamentally important. Currencies like opportunity recognition, all important. We have to learn that those are important. And when we discover that intelligence is important, but is not the only currency among many, then a person may be intellectually rich and also fundamentally economically rich. If you comprehend that, it is important, my friends, that we take those two so that you're economically rich but also intellectually rich. Then you become a good, rare individual in the concept of a firm and accomplished individual. I know Christians would argue, or perhaps spiritualists or religious people perhaps would argue in terms of the spiritual concept of it. That would be discussed another day. Because perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of a generation was believing that life is an examination and that school gives us that impression in terms of studying hard, in terms of answering correctly, for example, in terms of getting rewarded, automatic rewarded, perhaps because of our performances in school. But then you discover, lo and behold, life does operate differently. Life often asks bizarre questions, but they are real. What problem can you solve? That becomes a reality. How do you navigate from A to Z? The reward follows the solution, not necessarily the qualification. That is the bitter truth we have to understand. And that is why the mechanic, for example, who keeps 100 vehicles running may earn more than a graduate who understands the theory of engineers, for example. Not because the knowledge is useless, no, but because the market rewards problem solving. Have you solved the problem? And as I conclude, I'll tell you deep personal stories that have to do with the school of life. Long time ago, when we were just beginning to do our internship in one of the most popular law firms, and I will use these names on purpose because the people that I will mention have come up in this country to be one of those who perhaps have been successful, to use that word, successful in all arenas. And I was working at a law firm, popular law firm, perhaps the biggest law firm at that time in Eastern Central Africa, Katende Sempe and Company Advocates. And the senior partner there, JW Katende, senior counsel, had a daughter who was doing clerkship with us, internship, if you like. And she had started her senior six, but she was clerking, learning a few things. And so she was learning from us who were more like junior attorneys at the time. And so I was, of course, moved because I could see that she had the zeal and the passion. She was a young lady called Joan, I remember. And I wanted to ask her a few things about how she was being mentored, especially by such a legal general, senior counsel JW Katende. And so I asked her, I said, I think your father must be telling you to read all the books in the library, memorize every case, left, right, and center. And she said, no, incidentally. I said, what? You mean he never tells you that? He said, no, actually, my dad told me, when you are learning, try to learn something practical. I said, what? Because you see, the law had to do with a lot of memorization, you know? Lord what? Case what? Act what? Rule what? And here is this brilliant young lady telling me that the general, a legal general, senior counsel was actually saying, on top of what you're doing, learn as much as possible a practical skill. That sunk deep in me. I said, wow, maybe there's something I am missing here. Because I think when over a period of time I've got to learn that the things that really people are looking out for are the practical skills. What value are you able to add? Which reminds me, when we were asked to stay back because we did our clerkship there slightly after Louis von Vincent, we were asked to stay over and above some of our colleagues, not really because of anything, but because of the value we're adding to the law firm. Leave alone these ideas that senior counsel has told you to interpret memo X, or perhaps summarize case Y, or draft a pleading. It had to do with the value, because the firm was able to realize that, yes, X, Y, and Z can do that, but what can you do over and above that? So the reason why many of us are having these challenges in life is because we have been traditionally felt and taught in that concept that, see, the formula for survival is A, B, C, D. And you go into that box, talk about that box. The world has formed a box for you, and it forces you to fit in that box, forgetting that reality in life, the school of life, the hard lessons of life are not going to be necessarily answered by that school of box. Many times you have to think outside the box. And like my good friend, Dr. Roheza says, and throw the box away. Perhaps you should look for his book, What We Don't Teach at University, A Lecturer's Confession. It tells you some of the things that we are missing out, perhaps, in the ordinary training of individuals. Critical thinking, look at Critical Thinking by Nakalema of Makerere University. Those concepts. Have you ever asked yourselves why people like Bill Gates, perhaps, walked out of Harvard and the likes? You know? I mean, I could blatantly say that statement, but when you think about it in the real sense, it's not because they were lazy. No, far from that. In fact, many of the most successful people, the Steve Jobs and the likes, were able to have ideas that were not necessarily boxed within the university context or traditional context of knowledge. They were able to think outside the box and throw that box away. Now, life in university, education, whatsoever, gives us those, it creates boxes and puzzles. I was at a certain institution finishing a certain course because I don't want to offend some people. And an individual X was pressurizing, life should be looked at in certain concepts. And much as I appreciated that ideology, but life outside informed me otherwise. Because if you go back and ask, for example, these individuals who are forcing you to think within a zero box, what novel ideas, what inventive step, like they say in copyright or intellectual property, what inventive step has been added in that concept, you realize it's not there. Maybe time has come for us to use at a different method of analyzing or perhaps reevaluating individuals who we celebrate in society as having achieved certain things in the traditional sense because they have boxed certain ideas, forgetting that life is outside many times the box. You find people who have graduated with very honorable degrees in certain philosophies, which have been overtaken by events, but we still call them those titles. Ideology, fixed reasoning. Perhaps that's why countries like China are taking on another trend in terms of superiority in many aspects, because they have failed, they have refused to be boxed in those ideologies. So you go to traditional school, for example, you get your LLB, Ligam Baccalaureus, and then you go, you finish your LDC, you enrolled, you become an advocate, and then you realize money is not coming your way. And I'm not saying money answers all things. Yes, it does, so that the Bible tells us. But in the real context, you know what I'm talking about. Because otherwise, people like Steve Jobs would have died. Because they had the world, the money before them. So you are saying, you're put in this box, and you're failing that after university, I will box myself, I will understand this, I will argue these theories, or Hans Kelsen theory, whatever theory you want to argue. But then you realize there's a problem. Reality is failing, which reminds me in life, when we had finished, I think LDC at a certain time, I was walking on the streets of Kampala with a colleague, and the colleague was the other side of the road. And we were anxious, we were all heavy and excited. Life is going to obey us. Food is going to come our ways. We are going to eat KFC left, right, and center. And then 1 month, it's not there. 2 months, 3 months, you realize things are different. You're like, wait a minute, what is happening? And then one time I met this individual. Incidentally, it was a good Musaga friend of mine who was walking across the other street of the road. You know how Kampala can be. 2 roads, this side, this side, and so much commotion, traffic, and like. But the gentleman on the other side, and he waved at me and said, Isaac, hello. I was the guild president at LDC. So they knew me. Hello. And he said, hello. Then he used the Lusoga phrase, Muna, echintu chikalu. Echintu chikalu. Then I'm like, echintu chikalu, what does it mean? Obviously, echintu chikalu, for us, the Basogas will know that you're talking about a basket that is dry and empty. So in essence, we were saying, man, I'm here, but the thing is not there. And then it reminded me, about 5 years ago, now that it's about almost 25 years plus since we left school, an individual who was actually teaching at LDC, an advocate of the High Court, with all credentials, about 4 masters and PhD now attempting, and incredibly successful, said, I wish I had known what I knew. He's now in business. And I'm not saying that whatever business is doing, but his traditional business, or the sense that he's not in traditional advocacy, And I also know that people have excelled in advocacy. I have no doubt about that. I know them. But I was amazed because I thought things were flowing well. But you see, he understood life, that education, whether I'm a lawyer or a graduate or a medical doctor or an engineer or a physician, that degree should give you a platter to compete favorably. But it should not box you in terms of a box, because then you will not have food on your table. I know very many people, my colleagues, they call me and sometimes they tell you, tear-shedding stories of certain things that have hit them. They can't pay their rents. They can't make ends meet because the clients are not there. You ask the ordinary lawyer sometimes on the streets, or even in the law firms, you may realize that walking clients are not as often as we think. You have one client takes you probably almost 6 months. And so the pain is there. But because we are boxed, that boxing has reduced our opportunities to spring up over and above. Because even our tutors, our mentors have boxed us. They have boxed us as an ideology. Life is far, far, far much different from this ideology of boxing. Education cannot be compromised. Go get your degree, go get your master's, go get your PhD. But life should inform you in a way that you should learn to think over and above. I told you what Alvin Slaughter said. The illiterate of the 21st century is not the one who can read or write, but the one who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Certain concepts will force you, we have to learn, to relearn. There are novel situations we have to understand. AI now is on the way. And the biggest, people who fight it are perhaps lawyers. They even fight a concept they have not even learned. They even want to regulate a concept they don't even know. And when people try to learn it, they feel there's a problem. And you ask yourselves that these are people who call ourselves what? Here, my learned friend. Perhaps that ideology has to change. Because now what is learning? What's the true sense of learning? What's the true sense of a learned person? So these are serious issues that affect people. I know people who have gone through suicidal attempts, depression, because they feel what they have is useless. When they look around the corner, they see people who have never gone to school left, right, and center doing certain things and surviving because the other one has learned the skill of life. I am saying that education is important, but skill it. Learn it as a skill. Let it inform you to operate outside. I think the message that sometimes the government has painted wrong, this idea of find the jobs and what, you demoralize people when you categorically tell them find the jobs. Teach them how, skill them up, give them those incentives that learn how to skill up the things. Give them the idea that life is beyond the degree is the first stepping stone. Yes, if you have got it, wonderful. If you don't have it, you work towards it. And now learn to think with it, but also outside it. Outside it, I've seen people. I was in some place where I saw individuals who had actually gone into bakery, people had masters in law, for example, and they're doing extremely well. Florist, for example. In Europe, I was in Europe and I worked with my so-called doctorates in terms of my attempts and my credentials, and they couldn't provide food in countries like Germany because their law is different. We're talking about common law here. They're talking about something different. So it meant you have to almost undo and redo. So if you don't learn to have that ability to acclimatize, to adapt, to improvise, to overcome. That is a slogan for some branch of the US Army. Adapt, improvise, and overcome. You have to learn. That is how things will not be bad for you. Because I know many of us go through depression. Many of us go through pain. Many of us are saying, why did I even waste my time there? Why did I do this? You did right. Only that you have to change your thinking. Your thinking must change. Your contextualization of issues must change. Sometimes the real thing that gives us the food on the table may not be because you cited the right section of the law, but perhaps you talked well to a person, individual, and he'll pay you not really because of the law, but because you counseled them. It's the skills of life. Many of the victories I've achieved in terms of financial have not been because I've traditionally fought it in law, in courts of law. No. Sometimes it's ADR, mediation, conciliation, aspects like that. That's why my PhD comes from, my doctoral scholarism comes from Ubuntu and the law, humanizing the law in the concept of I am what I am until you are what you are. I cannot be what I am until you are what you are. The idea of that interconnectedness. So until we realize that, like Dr. Martin Luther King said, for whatever reason, our lives are inextricably bound. I cannot be what I am until you are what you are. So all these things, you have to learn to think outside the box. The reason why you are starving, the reason why you don't have payment for your rent, the reason why you are being looked left and center because of this is because, and yet you have the degree and whatever on you, is because you are failing to think outside the box. And I don't say this in pride or in arrogance. No, I say it in humility because I have been a victim of some of those pains, and I understand what you're going through. I do understand what the pain, the frustration, the depression that comes with it. The depression, more importantly, especially if you did your part. You were always up in class, you were always first in class, you burnt the midnight oil, and you knew that when I get this thing, I will have, answered every problem. And things don't seem to be working out. Sometimes it's because of society around us, the people around us. Interconnection skills, as I told you. The people around you can cause you a depression. You can be depressed so terribly that you lose focus. Even some of those fellas who think they're actually mentoring us, or perhaps even our bosses, sometimes you have to learn to undo some of those things. and to sometimes walk away slightly from some of them with wisdom, not with pride, but with wisdom. Being humble, being focused, being hungry. Being humble, being focused, being hungry. I have got jobs, certain opportunities, not because I had the best of the best, but because of interpersonal skills, my relationships. Then someone says, oh, okay, that will work for me. Or come and do this thing for me. Those concepts have become important in life. Maturity, emotional intelligence, skilling is extremely important with all those facets that go with it. That is how we shall be able to change the sad story of education paradox. I don't speak as a person who has made it, but I speak as a person who is continuously also learning. Otherwise, we would argue that perhaps not the most intelligent individual may actually even be the president of this country. He's intelligent in the military sense. But perhaps if you argue in terms of IQ with other people, you may find that they stand over and above. And yet he calls the shots at the end of the day. So you have to understand that it's a gaming thing, it's a skilling thing, it's a thinking out of the box thing, it's creating opportunities, but knowing how to maneuver within these opportunities, the cycle of life. The cycle of life. Life is not a destination, it is a journey. And the education, your degree is extremely important, but it is a journey within the bigger journey. And the earlier you understand that, wait a minute, I will use my intuition, I'll use my brains that God gave me. I had an individual went with in school way back in Chirakoli Boutique, I remember. And I will not mention his name, but he was always last in class. Always last in class. Even when we finished senior 6, I knew we have someone who's going to be last, unfortunately. And he was last, surely. Didn't get enough grades even to go to university. But slightly within the vacation, after we left that place, I met this individual selling ice cream with a bicycle on the streets of Ginger. And I said, hey, how are you, my friend? He said, hello, I actually bought some ice cream from the guy. 200 or 300. Then we went on with our things, went to university, blah, blah, blah. He did his thing. In the next 5 years, I met this individual driving the latest Prado. I said, wait, is he a driver? It was his, with a big company in about 5 years' time. And now he's giving us jobs. Come and do the thing for me. Was he a failure? Far from it. Far from it. Far from it. He just knew and understood how to think outside and contextualize his challenge. The memorization, the cramming may not have worked for him, but these other things worked for me. So you have to learn. And by the way, the learning is God-given. No one will necessarily teach you this concept. You just have to have a spark. You acquire the fire and you move mountains. And you can do all things, like this, the Bible says, or like the good book says, you can do all things as long as you believe in yourself and never give up. Never give up. And the sky is no longer the limit. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. Find many of our works at lubogo.org or sugeneslab.com, and at our YouTube, Lubogo Isaac Christopher, and at TikTok and every other. You can find our books now. We are probably, I think I'm having about 100 books plus now running under the name that God gave me. So you can enjoy many of these books. And why do we give them out free? Because we want to help the world, to make this world a much better place. And who knows who will come across a manuscript and say, wait a minute, let me make a call to this individual. So the next time you see us in better heights, it's because we have done our part. I thank you and God bless you. Amen.